everyone. Welcome back to the White Coat Club. This is Lindsay, and I am a counselor at MinPrep. And today I also have Nicole with me, but we also have a special guest. We have Shevtali. She's also a MoonPrep essay coach and mentor. And more importantly, she's also a student in the BSMD program at Case Western Reserve. So we're going to be learning quite a bit about the program and some of her insights and her experiences there. And before we get started, don't forget to like and subscribe to get more BSMD and med school admissions advice. Okay, so since this is your first time on the podcast, Shevtali, do you mind introducing yourself?
Of course. Thanks for the introduction, Lindsay. My name is Shevtali. I'm a second-year med student at Case Western Reserve University School of Medicine. I went through Case's BSMD program and I graduated in May of 2022 with a bachelor's in neuroscience and minors in economics and chemistry. I went through Case's BSMD program and graduated in 3 years, so I took a year off in between where I worked at Horizon Therapeutics, which is a biotech company. And then now I'm in my second year of med school. I'm currently interested in ENT and I do research in both neurosurgery and otolaryngology.
Perfect. Okay. I feel like Case Western is like one of the more popular schools. Whether I put it on kids' lists or not, I feel like it's always there. Definitely one of the more popular ones. So hopefully this will be a popular podcast with our students. So I guess before we kind of dive into your experiences, will you tell us a little bit about like the stats and resume of your peers? If you know, like, any things that they were involved in high school, if it was clubs or passion projects or things like that.
Mm-hmm. So I will say that most students in my cohort for PPSP had a 3.8 or higher GPA. Most of us probably had a 4.0 and scored fairly high on the ACT and SAT, probably above a 1550 for the SAT and a 34 or higher on the ACT, but likely a 35 or higher. And in terms of the application itself, Case really likes to see a lot of research experiences from their high school students. So I know most of my peers and I had some form of research experience in high school, whether that was wet lab or public health or something more like a literature review. And simultaneously, like other BSMDs, they're also looking for applicants who have volunteered and who have shadowed in the medical field. I think overall, each of us had done our own part in exploring the medical field in multiple ways, and that's something that Case really values. So they like to see this balance between seeing research, but also having shadowed in certain specialties, and you kind of interacted with patients in some kind of a clinical setting, just to know that like you've explored medicine from a broad perspective.
Obviously, it sounds like you're a little bit older than like the pandemic year of graduating or the pandemic like application year. So none of your peers were test optional, is that right?
Correct.
Okay. Do you know of anyone in the program like who's obviously younger than you who was test optional?
I'm not sure about the younger cohorts, so I don't know if any of them have been test optional, but I know Case did go test optional for a while, so it's possible.
Yeah. I know it's always like the elusive thing where I don't have many test optional kids. And then when you do have one, it's like, well, I've only really had like four. And, I've only had one kid who got in test optional to a BSMD program, and they did have like an exceptional like resume outside of it. So the other ones didn't necessarily, and that was probably the cause of them not getting accepted. So I feel like it's always tough with test optional students. I believe they might still be test optional this year. I'm not sure what they'll be for like the 2025, 2026 cycle, but who
Hmm.
knows? And so it sounds like on the application, you should be emphasizing research for sure. But do you think like volunteering and shadowing are also things that should be emphasized on the application?
Absolutely. I think for Case, it's important to strike a balance in your application. So trying not to like lean just only one way or the other, but making sure that you're having room for the research experiences because that's what really makes applicants stand out. Most applicants are going to have that volunteering and shadowing as kind of a given, and then the research is what's going to differentiate students.
Mhm. Is there any like qualities students should demonstrate in the application?
I think for Case and both for the undergrad school and the med school, teamwork and collaboration are really important to our education. There's a lot of small group work that's done in classes in undergrad, and the entirety of our preclinical years in med school is small group learning based. So they're really looking for students who are able to work well with others, who've demonstrated teamwork, and who've also demonstrated leadership among groups that they've worked with. So I think being able to highlight those qualities in your application is really important. And simultaneously, they're also looking for students that are very reflective and open to growth and feedback. So while that's difficult to demonstrate with just like an activities list on your application, keeping that in mind with some of the essays you write will go a long way. They're really looking for that growth mindset in students. It's something that in med school is really important to them. So trying to bring that out in your application is also really important.
Do you know if case reviews the personal statement in their like BSMD review? I don't know if you like know that much about it.
From my understanding, they review both our personal statement and our like supplemental, like why medicine and our extra essay that we're allowed to provide them with, because during my interview with the admissions members from med school, they've referred to my personal statement, but I'm also not certain if that was just the people that were interviewing me or if that's like standard practice.
Yeah, I mean, that was like my instinct that they probably are because I feel like a lot of the times when you submit it all together, like on the Common App or the Coalition or wherever, a lot of times they are reviewing everything. But if it's like a supplemental application, like I know for University of Arizona, they won't review everything. They just kind of review the BSMD part of the application. So that's good to know in general. And then last on like the stat side of things, is there any in-state preference?
Not that I know of. I mean, I don't think I would, I can confidently say that a majority of my cohort is out of state. So I don't think that there is any in-state preference, but don't quote me on it.
Yeah, no, that's what I thought too. Because I feel like, and once again, this is a generalization and not like a rule, but a lot of times when it is like a private university with like a private medical school, a lot of times they don't have as heavy of an in-state preference. But there's always exceptions to every rules, but that was definitely my understanding of Case Western too.
All right, so I'm gonna have some questions about the actual application and the process. Could you kind of explain a little bit about what the application timeline looks like for case?
So CASE requires all of their material to be submitted by December 1st. So this includes the Common App, which includes both like your admission stuff for regular decision and then also for the BSMD program. So all of that material is due December 1st. And once you've submitted your application, usually in the middle of January is when CASE will send out interview invites to the PPSP finalists. And at this time, if you do receive an invite to the interview, you will also receive like your admission to CASE as an undergrad school. Now, the other option that can happen is that you may not get an interview, but you will still hear back about your decision to case. So that's what will happen in the middle of January. And then after that, in about March or April is when your interview, like the end of March, is when your interviews will happen with case. And the case interview usually consists of an individual interview and a group interview. And then after that, in April, at the very beginning of April, is when you will hear back about your PPSP decision.
Gotcha. So it's a pretty long, kind of drawn out timeline. I think a lot of students are shocked that to know that they won't find out about their final decision until like later into the spring than they would like.
Yeah.
Um,
I always
Yeah,
like to,
I
oh, go
for
for it. Sorry.
context, Case was my last school that I found out about. Like I was basically deciding between everything else before I had even heard back. And then it was like a game changer when I heard back from Case. And it was the last school I heard back from.
wow. So do you know how many students get admitted each year?
So my cohort was about 18 students that get admitted. And from my understanding, Case usually admits between 16 and 20 students each year.
So then if they're admitting, do you know how many are in your class? If they're admitting 16 to 18, do they go off of a wait list or
I think they do, but I'm not positive.
yeah, I know some schools like try to keep it at the number that they have capacity for. So if students deny and say I don't want to go here, I got in elsewhere, they'll go off of the wait list, and some will not even hold a wait list. But it sounds like they're kind of keeping true to the capacity that they have.
Yeah, I definitely don't think the cohort size has changed significantly over time. And I think that's mainly to keep like only a small number of seats allocated in their med school class for PPSP students and to let the rest of them be for traditional applicants.
So, kind of switching gears a little bit, what do you think made your application stand out when you applied, if anything?
That's a really good question. And I think it's a little hard for me to talk about it because it was definitely a few years ago now. But I do think that the research component helped my application a lot because I'd done both public health and wet lab research. And I think the combination allowed me to kind of speak to my interest in medicine from both like a broad healthcare system perspective, but also from a molecular level of medicine. And then I think the other thing that helped me stand out as an applicant was my second supplemental essay that I submitted, which is on any topic or like any achievement that hasn't been mentioned in your application thus far. I talked a lot about it during my interview, and I think it was something that kind of captured the interest of my admissions officer. So it was definitely helped me have something that like they could remember me by, and it was something that I could talk a lot about. The third thing that I remember distinctly during my interview was getting asked a lot of questions about like what challenges do you see in medicine? What are some things that you think are like issues that need to be tackled in medicine? And those kind of questions were ones that I think I was really able to pull from my passion project and research to answer. And I think that helped that I had kind of like thought critically about those questions ahead of time.
It's interesting that you mentioned the essay asking, that's something else that's not listed prior, because I feel like, I don't know, Lindsay, I wonder if you're the same, but I feel like we get that question so often. Like, what do we write about? What am
Mhm.
I supposed to say? So it's interesting that you think that that was one of the main reasons that you stood out.
I agree. I feel like that's something kids struggle with. So taking time to think about it early. It may not be like an essay question, but I feel like it pops up a lot of times in the interviews.
Yeah.
So that kind of covers the application, I think. And I know we kind of talked a little bit about the interview and we've mentioned a little bit about it, but do you mind diving a little bit more into it about like what the format was for you?
Yeah,
If you
so the individual interview is with the admissions office from the med school. So it's members of the admissions team that also works to coordinate like the admissions to med school itself, but they're the ones that will interview the PPSP applicants if it's still the same as it was a couple of years ago. And during that conversation, they really ask you about your motivation for going into medicine, as well as try and get a sense of like how have you prepared yourself for the challenges of medicine? Oftentimes, medicine is like a very glorified field for like students, especially in high school and younger, but they really want to look for maturity in their applicants. So they want to hear from students about how they've kind of gone beyond just like the traditional, like medicine helps people. Like, how have you gone beyond that? And what have you learned about it that's more specific to your interests or what piques your curiosity? And I think that's something that they really try and focus on during the interview. And I touched on this a little bit before, but they're really looking for that mature aspect. They want applicants who they are confident are going to make great physicians, and that's a decision they're making 8 years before you're actually going to become a physician. So you kind of have to show your maturity at a level that's above a traditional 18-year-old. So you want to think of you want to think of showing maturity that's more of at a 20 or 22-year-old level, which really comes from doing a lot of reading, a lot of research, and like a lot of listening to people who are currently in the field and trying to take key points away from that about like what do they see as challenges in medicine, what are things that have excited them about medicine, what has medicine look like for them. And I think that's something that's really important to do, and it's something that's really easy to start doing even before you're prepping for the interview. Just reading books about different sides of medicine, listening to podcasts, anything to kind of get yourself more familiar with the field and kind of the language that's used in it. And then transitioning gears to the group interview. During the group interview, you're placed into small groups. My interview is in person, but I believe that they do virtual interviews now. So this might be done in the format of breakout rooms. And the first few rounds are kind of like just rapid fire, like 1 to 2 minute answers from each applicant, and they'll kind of like go around. But then afterwards, they'll ask for applicants to do a group activity, and that can vary. I'm not really sure how it's done with the virtual format anymore, but the key with the group interview that they're looking for is collaboration and teamwork. So they want to look for students who demonstrate an ability to connect and work well with others. They're listening to others' ideas while simultaneously trying to take initiative to help strategize, put together a plan, and execute. They want to see that leadership without any domination. And that's kind of the balance that you want to make sure that you're striking. You want to listen to others while also trying to help organize the group. And I think framing it like that as a mindset for yourself of I'm here to help organize, not necessarily take charge, is really important because the latter can be seen as more of a negative characteristic as opposed to a positive one.
Yeah, one of those things that you said is something I feel like we always stress here on the podcast is like the emotional maturity side of things and being able to demonstrate that. I feel like activities are always a good way to be able to showcase it. And it can be really tough, like, as an 18-year-old having those like experiences that do give you the ability to gain some of those like emotional maturity and like deep passion for medicine too, being able to go deeper. So I think that was all really, really helpful advice, hopefully to students as they go through this process. Did you do like any formal like interview prep with anyone, or how did you prepare for your interview?
I didn't. I really wrote down a list of questions that I'd kind of gathered from prior VSMD interviews. I think I was very lucky that case also happened to be my last VSMD interview, so I'd had a few reps under my belt by this point, and that helped me kind of like know, okay, these are questions that commonly come up. Let's try and make sure we have answers for them. And I just prepped a lot by like saying things out loud to myself, making bullet pointed lists for myself to make sure that when I was asked questions, I was kind of covering the key points without reciting things necessarily. And as I mentioned before, I did my passion project kind of revolved around speaking to doctors from different healthcare systems and hearing their thoughts on benefits, cons, things that excite them about their field of medicine in the specific country and system that they're practicing in, how they see medicine progressing in their specific area. And I feel like in general, these conversations really helped me have answers for questions that were really related to medicine because even though I might not have necessarily like shadowed these physicians by just talking to them, I was kind of able to pull from it. And I was like, well, I've heard this from like a few physicians, or I've heard that from others. And that was something that I could really bring up in my interview a lot. So in general, I really do think that like the research component of like learning different perspectives of medicine goes a long way in your interview because you're able to use that information in your answers. And it definitely shows when a student has gone the extra mile to really understand the field that they're attempting to step into.
Yeah, for sure. Preparation is always key. Don't wing it. Don't wing it and, take the time. I like what you said too about how you wrote down bullet points for your interview prep because you want to sound practiced, but not like robotic. I guess you want to sound smooth and like, prepared, but not too
Mhm.
practiced. So there's like that fine line between like not being prepared and like being overly prepared. So I think what you did really worked, and hopefully our students kind of take a leaf out of your book as well. Anything else that you can think of about the interview that we should know?
I think the last thing is just making sure that you have very specific questions ready. And while this goes for every interview, I think trying to keep in mind that if you're speaking to someone who is a physician, or if you're speaking to someone that has like a specific kind of experience with within the medical field, try and ask specific questions about that, because the more like tailored your questions are, again, the better it shows how well prepared you are for the interview.
It's a great idea. Yeah, I think that that's something that kids will forget about, and they'll just be like, oh, wing it when you get there. It's really hard to wing things on the top of your head. So I love that idea of preparing good questions and really tailored to the person.
Yeah, so let's switch gears to kind of talking about student life and kind of like what things are like at Case Western. Just like some kind of random questions that we get a lot and that we're just kind of curious about. Um, First one is, can you finish the program earlier than 8 years if you bring in sufficient AP credits?
So you cannot graduate any earlier from med school than what your contract says. You basically are not able to matriculate to the School of Medicine until the year that your contract would have said that you should. So when
Mm.
I entered case, I was set to enter med school in 2023 and graduate med school in 2027. When I decided that I wanted to graduate from undergrad a year earlier, that was totally okay by the med school, by the undergrad program, but I was not allowed to start med school earlier than 2023, hence the pseudo gap year that I took between between my undergrad and med school years. And it's pretty common for students at Case to graduate in 3 years from undergrad and take that year off. I highly recommend the year I took off. It was really important for me to like kind of get other experiences that I wouldn't have gotten otherwise. But in general, with enough AP credits, you can graduate from your undergrad program earlier, but you cannot graduate from med school any earlier than you would have wanted to. On the flip side, with your PPSP admission, you can defer an extra year after undergrad. So if you do 4 years of undergrad and you want to still take a year off, you can defer your med school admission to 1 year afterwards. And then you will take a year off and then start med school. And that's something that you can also consider. There are a few students that do that to either pursue a different career in the middle or to become a Fulbright scholar or some other kind of like educational opportunity. And that's something that you are able to do at Case.
Oh, that's pretty cool to know that you have like you have the time to do other things, but you're just not going to graduate from med school earlier. Um, I think that'll be of interest to a lot of students who, like you said, have other interests and want to kind of explore those in the meantime. So next one, how does Case Western's PPSP support students who want to study medicine alongside other fields like business, tech, public health, etc.? I think you kind of touched on it when you're saying, they have like an extra year potentially, but um, more specifically, I guess, how could you kind of do two different studying paths at one time?
Yes, I think Case is great for this. My roommate also went through PPSP. I know she was like a public policy major and like still was PPSP at the same time. I personally also did a minor in economics. It's very easy to kind of integrate other fields along with medicine, especially because there are a limited number of requirements for PPSP students, but aside from those class requirements, you can major in whatever you want. It does not have to necessarily be science related. The other thing is CASE in general has a lot of internship opportunities for students, and that's something that PPSP students are also eligible to participate in and simultaneously encouraged to participate in. I did one of those remote internship programs during my sophomore year of school. And I also interned at Horizon Therapeutics, the biotech company, after my sophomore year of school. And then that's kind of how I ended up working there during my gap year. And everything I did at Horizon was not necessarily directly related to medicine. I did corporate social responsibility. I did a little bit of communications. So a lot of my focus was on nothing directly related to medicine. It was obviously a biotech company that worked with patients, but I think I developed a lot of skill sets that were different from the ones that are traditionally gained in like a wet lab research space. That being said, I guess where I'm going with this is that PPSP students have like complete flexibility over what to study, whether that is business, tech, dance, art, etc. And you're more than welcome to like do internships in those fields, take a gap year to work in that field, or to even like pursue it on the side, both in undergrad and med school. And I think that's something that's really important, especially for students that have like multiple interests. I think when students go the traditional path, there's this kind of like, it's not necessarily a need, but it's pretty much like a tradition to do a couple of years of research if you are going to take years off between undergrad and med school. And students typically work as like a research assistant, or they work as a clinical research coordinator, or they work within like a specific lab. And that's something that like PPSP students don't necessarily have to do. Like if research isn't your focus, there are other ways to still contribute to like medicine and your overarching learning without doing traditional research. And the fact that CASE supports that is something that I think is really important to highlight.
I think that flexibility is just something that's not as common with a lot of the BSMD programs. So I think that's probably a really drawing factor for a lot of kids who do have a lot of different interests. It's really hard for high school students to really nail down a major, I think. And then, when they're applying BSMD, oftentimes they're stuck to like just maybe two or three different majors that they have to choose from. So being able to have that flexibility, I think, is really great and probably what draws a lot of kids into wanting to apply. What do you like and dislike about Case's campus culture?
So I alluded to this at the beginning, but I think it's really important that CASE emphasizes collaboration among their students. It's very stereotypical for pre-meds to be cutthroat at a lot of institutions, and I did not feel that at Case. I have friends that were like going through the traditional track, not necessarily PPSP, and they share similar sentiments to me in the sense that all of our pre-med classes were always very collaborative. There was never like a sense of like someone was trying to one up each other or gatekeep resources. And I think that's something that's like really important when you're entering a field like medicine. There's a lot to learn. It's really hard to learn it all on your own. So having some kind of community where there's a lot of study groups, there's a lot of study sessions, there's a lot of collaboration among peers really helps to take the stress and like the toll of the work off of you. And even in med school, like the collaboration is huge and it's something that I value so much. And I'm not really sure how I would go through med school without having that kind of a collaborative environment that CASE really emphasizes. And, it's something that they encourage, not just as like, oh, well, you can work with people. It's like, no, you should work with people. And I think that really changes the game for students. In terms of things I dislike, there's not a lot. I think the only thing to keep in mind is that CASE is a STEM school at the end of the day. They have a lot of students that come here, whether it's for medicine or engineering or computer science. It just tends to lean heavier on the STEM side. And sometimes that can make students feel like you're kind of living in the STEM bubble and there's less discussion on like politics or maybe the arts. Theater is not necessarily as popular at Case as it might be at other schools. We aren't like, we're a D3 school, so sports necessarily aren't like something that students bond over at Case. But those aren't really things that like made a huge role in my like education whatsoever. And I still found friends that I was able to like experience things like musicals and sports games with. But I think it's just something to keep in mind about Case's culture and like knowing that the school that you're coming into is going to lean a little more STEM heavy.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Where you're talking about you're not going to maybe have some of the other conversations that you may have or like the happenings that you may have at a liberal arts school. I think we get a lot of students who apply every year to the BSMD program, but then I know for myself, I have a lot of students that if they didn't get into the BSMD, they still ultimately decide to go there for undergrad for
Mhm.
science. But maybe if you're not like truly dedicated to a STEM field, if you're one of those students who are a little bit more unsure, it might not be the best route. Um, that's interesting. I never would have thought of that actually.
Yeah, same. Yeah, I think that's a really good insight that it is like a very STEM heavy school. And obviously, like we know that there is like a big emphasis on research. And so that when I logically think about it, it does make sense. But I mean, that's all
Yeah.
good to hear and can help us like later on with making lists with our students and making sure ultimately that if a student does kind of have those dual interests, that maybe CASE isn't the right place for them then to
Mhm.
to pursue that liberal arts side of them.
Yeah. I think you kind of touched on this in things that you've said, but things that differentiate the Case Western's BSMD program from others. I know you mentioned earlier this was the last acceptance that you received. So maybe a little bit of like how you came to your ultimate decision to attend here.
I think for me, it really came down to Case's med school. I knew that becoming a physician was my ultimate goal, and I also knew that I wanted to potentially pursue a residency that might be fairly competitive. So I wanted to pick a school that was going to like help me get there in the long run. And for me, that really meant finding the med school that was going to get me there, which Case's med school is very highly ranked. It's also very highly respected in the med school community. And it's something that I heard from a lot of upperclassmen where it's like when doctors or other residency programs are like, oh, you're from Case, like that kind of has a different, it carries a different connotation. And that's something that really stood out to me, knowing that I would want that on my side. Case is also located in a area that has a ton of research opportunities. And as someone who knew she wanted to do a little bit of research in undergrad and in med school, I wanted to find somewhere where I would have a lot of options to choose from. And being in like close proximity to the Cleveland Clinic, University Hospitals, Veterans Affairs, and Metro Health was something that stood out to me because it meant that there was like a plethora of options to choose from. And it likely meant that I would find physicians or like PIs that were doing research in fields that I was interested in. And I definitely found that during undergrad, and I have that now. Something else that I've kind of learned in med school, but I definitely think it plays a role in undergrad when you're picking your BSMD, is Case is uniquely positioned to give students like this opportunity to learn from a private health system, a public health system, and a VA health system. And I think that is so incredible in our like incredibly complex healthcare system to be able to have this experience with all three institutions. And that's not something that you find at a lot of BSMD programs. It just so happens that it's because of the location of Case and its proximity to all of these institutions. But I think it's something to consider when you're thinking about like the long term and what kind of exposures and experiences do you want to have during your undergrad and med school years. And then besides all of these things, I think it goes without saying that like knowing that I was going to be able to maybe graduate a year earlier, take a pseudo year off was something that definitely stood out to me. I knew that I didn't necessarily want to go the 6 year route. That felt very rushed to me personally. So to me, I really like that Case kind of gives you the time to still grow and learn at a similar pace to those who go the traditional route, but it takes the stress off of like the admission because you're guaranteed your acceptance to med school, and it's kind of like you're still able to go at the same pace as everyone else, but you're able to do it with a little less stress on your plate, and that means that there's more opportunities for you to engage in your passions earlier.
Do you think you like having, I don't know if this was something you really addressed, but do you think your AP credits helped you be able to graduate a year early, or would it be possible to do even if you didn't have a ton of AP credits?
I definitely think the AP credits played a large role, especially for like things like minoring in econ. I didn't have to take the preliminary econ courses like 101 or 102 because I came in with AP credit. The AP credit for bio it doesn't play a role, but for things like math, I took no math classes in college, which I think helped a lot because that was like another open spot on my schedule. I didn't have to take psych because I had AP credit for that. So things like that, I think the AP credit definitely helps you check off some of the specific pre-med requirements, and that can again like save you some classes and open up room in your schedule to fit in the electives for your major or minor.
And then I guess my last one was if you regret the decision of doing BSMD versus the traditional route.
I think this is a really hard question to answer. I definitely don't regret it. I am very content with where I am right now, and I'm really grateful to have taken it pretty easy during my undergrad years without having to stress about admission. I definitely still I worked a job, I still did research, I still pursued an internship. It just meant that I was able to do all of those things without necessarily worrying about how they were stacking up on my resume and whether or not they were good enough to get into med school. I kind of was just able to do them with like the passion of actually doing them. And I think that was something that I am very grateful for because I think especially for students pursuing medicine, it's very rare in your trajectory up until you're a physician to be able to like not think about the next like admissions process, the next residency match, the next fellowship. Like you're constantly like having to apply for things. So it was like a very blissful 4 years of not having to stress about that. And simultaneously, the pseudo gap year that I got to take was great. I traveled during it, I worked, I was able to live in a city that I definitely wouldn't have been able to live in otherwise. And that was all things that I am very grateful for. But I don't know, like, I think there are also things that I might have missed out on from having doing a traditional BSMD track. Um, I think there's aspects of like for me personally, like startups and tech and business that I was able to explore a little bit, but I think there might have been other opportunities at a less STEM focused school that could have offered those. That's not to say that I definitely don't regret my decision, but it's something that I do keep in mind when I'm telling other students about the decision that they're making, and to just know that no matter which path you take, you're going to be sacrificing something. And it's important to keep in mind what those things are just to make sure that you're conscious of that, like that sacrifice that you're making and that you're okay with that sacrifice.
That makes sense. I think that's more of a question that we get from a lot of the younger students or like the 11th graders who, okay, am I really going to go for this or am I going to go for just a traditional route? But I think like I kind of like what you said, you just have to choose your hard. They're both going to be really difficult, just kind of choosing the one that works better for you.
So it sounds like you didn't regret your choice of going to Case Western, though. Is that right?
Yes, I definitely did not regret it.
And I have like one quick little question to when did you begin when did you decide you wanted to do BSMD? Did you know like really early on, like as a freshman, sophomore, or did it come later on that you were interested in BSMD?
I don't think it was actually at the forefront of my mind. During my junior year meeting with my college counselor, that's when I first started to consider BSMDs. And I didn't really have case on my radar. I only applied to like 4 BSMDs, which is definitely less than what the average is now. But I like wasn't really sure that I wanted to do BSMD, much less like had explored a ton of BSMDs. I had spoken with someone else who kind of added Case Western to my list. They were like, why aren't you considering Case? It's so close and it's a direct med program and it's a STEM school. And that's kind of how I ended up putting it on my list. But when I visited the school, I really liked my experience here. And I knew that like when I got my admissions letter, I was like, okay, I definitely really liked Case. So I think I should go here. But I think I made the decision pretty late. And I think for me, that was because I was very set on going to a tier one or like an Ivy school for a long time. And that's kind of what I thought my goal was. But the more I had conversations with other individuals, the more I learned about how if the physician if becoming a physician is the goal, then in a lot of cases, BSMD can make more sense over an Ivy League school. However, if you're like unsure about becoming a physician, but like maybe it's just healthcare is your goal, but whether that's like the business side, the tech side of it, or the science side of it specifically, like if you're unsure about that, then there's a lot more value in going to a school where you can kind of explore those options. So once I learned that, I started to weigh the two, and that's kind of when I decided, okay, I was going to apply to BSMDs. But like I said, I only applied to four, and in retrospect, I'm very lucky that I got into case. But I think like most students now apply to many more BSMDs.
I think they do too. They definitely do. It's pretty competitive out there. Well, that's helpful, but obviously you were still doing like a great job on building resumes and like had a deep passion for medicine in general, even before you picked to go on like the BSMD route.
Yeah, like I definitely knew medicine was in the like I knew medicine was something that I wanted to pursue, but I just wasn't really aware of the BSMD track for a long time. And then when I did, it was just like a slow build of like learning about it and then being like, okay, this sounds like it would work for me. But I think I had like because I was just passionate about research and things in healthcare. My resume had just kind of aligned with it. And so when it came time to apply, I didn't necessarily have a hard time filling my activities with clinically related activities just because that's what I'd ended up
Mhm.
like spending most of my time doing in high school anyways.
So it worked out really well.
It really did.
Hey, do you have anything else you want to share about your experiences at Case or anything else that kids should know about Case Western?
Not really. I think I covered it all, but I think in short, if I were to summarize, I think one, Cleveland's a growing city and our hospital systems are growing equally fast. So I think it's like a great place to pursue your medical education if you're looking for something where you're gonna be like at the forefront of a lot of innovations.
Nice. Yeah, don't sleep on Ohio. Okay, well, I think that's it for us today. Thanks so much, Shevtali, for sharing your insights. And hopefully, you all found it as insightful as we did on the program and life on the Case Western campus. If you haven't done so already, make sure to like and subscribe, and then you'll get more great BSMD and undergrad admissions news. Until next time, see you then.